For over 400 years, more than 12 million men and women were forcibly taken from their homeland in Africa and transported as slaves to the Americas and Europe. This historic forced migration continues to shape the continent and redefine the socio-cultural, economic, and political development of African people. The act of robbing African countries of their much-needed labor force by taking men and women in their prime and productive age not only had immediate effects on economic activities, but also contributed to the long-term poverty experienced in the continent. In this video, we will discuss the enduring impact of slavery on African cultures and economies, a stain that remains on the continent even after the abolition of this inhumane practice. Slavery stands as one of the most brutal practices in human history, and its devastating effects on African societies cannot be overstated. For centuries, European powers exploited and plundered Africa for slaves, which had an irreversible impact on the continent's economic progress. Africa's human resources were drained through various routes, including the Sahara, the Red Sea, Indian Ocean ports, and the Atlantic. Slavery persisted for at least 10 centuries, benefiting Muslim countries from the 9th to the 19th century, followed by more than 4 centuries of regular slave trade to build the Americas and European Christian states. The figures, although disputed, are staggering. 4 million slaves were exported via the Red Sea, another 4 million through Swahili ports of the Indian Ocean, perhaps as many as 9 million along the Trans-Saharan caravan route, and 11 to 20 million across the Atlantic Ocean. Among these slave routes, the European Atlantic trade receives the most attention and generates the most debate. It is the least poorly documented to date, but more importantly, it exclusively targeted Africans, while Muslim countries enslaved both blacks and whites. This form of slavery undeniably contributed the most to the present situation in Africa. It permanently weakened the continent, leading to its colonization by Europeans in the 19th century, and it fostered the racism and contempt from which Africans still suffer. To truly comprehend the impact of slavery on African culture, it is vital to understand the origins and nature of the transatlantic slave trade. This horrific practice began in the 15th century and lasted until the 19th century. It involved the capture and sale of African people to European traders, who transported them across the Atlantic Ocean to be sold as slaves in the Americas. Economic interests fueled this trade in human beings, facilitated by European colonial powers that established forts and trading posts along the African coast for the buying and selling of enslaved Africans. One of the most significant impacts of slavery on African culture was the loss of traditional knowledge and practices. Enslaved Africans were forcefully uprooted from their homes, families, and communities, and transported to unfamiliar lands where they were enslaved. They were stripped of their cultural identities, languages, and religions, and coerced into adopting the customs and practices of their enslavers. This process of cultural assimilation had a devastating effect on African societies, eroding many cultural practices and traditions passed down through generations. For example, the oral tradition of storytelling, which played a vital role in African communities, was lost due to slavery. Storytelling allowed people to transmit their history, traditions, and beliefs to future generations. However, with the forced migration of millions of Africans across the Atlantic, the practice of storytelling was disrupted and eventually disappeared. Enslaved Africans were often forbidden from using their native languages or practicing their traditional religions, instead forced to adopt the languages and religions of their enslavers. Another casualty of slavery was traditional African music. Music held great significance in African societies, serving various functions such as religious worship, storytelling, and entertainment. Yet, with the forced migration to the Americas, many traditional African instruments were lost or destroyed, and the practice of traditional African music was disrupted. Enslaved Africans were compelled to adopt the music and dance styles of their enslavers, further eroding traditional African culture. Religion also underwent significant changes due to slavery. Many African societies had their own religions, often characterized by animism and polytheism. However, with the arrival of European colonizers and the practice of slavery, Africans were coerced into converting to Christianity. Forced conversion often involved violence and trauma, resulting in the loss of traditional religious practices and beliefs. To this day, many African societies struggle to reconcile their traditional beliefs with Christianity, which was imposed upon them by their colonizers. Apart from the loss of cultural practices, slavery had a profound impact on the social and economic structures of African societies. The slave trade disrupted communities as people were forcefully uprooted, leading to a loss of labor and skills that significantly affected African economies. The slave trade also left a legacy of violence and trauma, which continues to affect African societies. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, African societies had developed sophisticated systems of trade, production, and commerce. Each region specialized in various goods and services, contributing to economic growth. For instance, West Africa was known for gold, ivory, and textiles, while East Africa excelled in spices, cotton, and livestock. The trans-Saharan trade connected West Africa to the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Europe, facilitating the exchange of valuable resources. Similarly, the Indian Ocean trade brought wealth and prosperity to East Africa by connecting it to the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. However, the arrival of Europeans marked a new era characterized by violence, exploitation, and plunder. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, and French powers established trading posts along the African coast, exchanging firearms, alcohol, and textiles for slaves captured in the interior. The slave trade severely disrupted African economies by disrupting trade networks, destroying local industries, and destabilizing societies. The demand for slaves created a massive incentive for African rulers and traders to capture and sell their fellow Africans, leading to widespread violence and conflict. Consequently, many regions became depopulated. Overall, the impact of slavery on African cultures and economies has been far-reaching and continues to be felt to this day. Slavery not only caused the loss of cultural practices and traditions, but also disrupted social structures and hindered economic progress. Understanding this history is crucial for comprehending the challenges and resilience of African societies in their ongoing quest for cultural preservation and socio-economic development. Traditions. Violence and force were often used to maintain European dominance over Africa, resulting in the loss of countless lives and the destruction of communities and infrastructure. European colonizers exploited African labor, forcing African populations to work in mines and plantations owned by European companies. This economic exploitation led to the fall of traditional African economic systems and practices that were often more sustainable and equitable. The imposition of European cultures and values on African populations resulted in the loss and stunting of African culture. African languages, religions, legal systems, and economic practices were suppressed or erased, leaving many African populations disconnected from their own traditions and cultural heritage. Despite the damage inflicted by European colonizers, African cultures have persisted and continue to thrive today. Many African populations are working to revive traditional practices and reclaim their cultural heritage. However, the impact of slavery and colonialism on Africa's development is undeniable. Without these devastating practices, it is likely that the continent would be more economically and socially developed, with stronger communities, institutions, and a unique cultural identity. While we cannot change the past, it is important to acknowledge it and work towards building a more equitable and just world. By understanding the enduring impact of slavery and colonialism, we can strive to create a better future for all people. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.